The land was a silence unto itself. Out where the Sabre River had dried to a threadbare whisper, the earth cracked open like old skin, and the wind dragged its slow hymn across the plain. Nothing moved except for the sagebrush bowing low, as if to remember something ancient. The sky, wide and pale as bone, hung over it all with a terrible stillness, like it had forgotten the world ever changed. From the eastern rise came a horse, lamed in the hind leg, stumbling beneath a rider slumped in the saddle. The man rode as if his body had forgotten how to hold itself. Blood had dried in thick ropes down his side, his shirt torn, where a bullet had passed clean, but angry. His beard was weeks old, his eyes sunburnt and half-closed. He did not groan, he did not pray. He simply leaned forward as the horse found its way toward the last shade it could find, a sagging cabin buried in a stand of cottonwoods that looked too tired to stand. He dismounted without grace, landing on one knee, the dry soil puffing up around him like smoke. He crawled the last few steps to the porch, pushing the warped door open with a hand that trembled only slightly. Inside, dust, an overturned stool, a table half-eaten by termites, a single bed covered in moth-bitten blankets. No sound save for the rasp of the wind through the cracks in the walls. He collapsed, not asleep, not unconscious, just still, as if something inside him had gone quiet. Hours passed. Then came the sound of soft footsteps in the brittle grass, the creak of the door, a figure in the doorway, small, unhurried. A girl, maybe 14, maybe 16. Her dress was faded blue, mended at the knees. Her boots were too large, stuffed with rags. Her hair hung loose and wild, like she'd stopped caring what people thought a long time ago. She stepped into the cabin without flinching, saw the man, the blood, the pistol still holstered at his side. She stood a long moment, saying nothing. Then she crouched beside him and touched his neck. Still warm, still breathing. The man's eyes opened, just barely. He didn't ask who she was. She didn't tell him. She brought water in a dented tin cup, pressed it to his lips. He drank without question. Outside, a hawk cried once and disappeared into the copper sky. She set to work in silence, stripping the torn shirt, boiling water from the old iron pump, tearing the cleanest part of her slip for bandages. Her hands were steady. She didn't look away from the wound or from the scar that crossed his ribs like a crooked river. The bullet had passed through. Infection would be the only enemy now. She sat by the door that night, knees hugged to her chest, watching him breathe, watching the desert turn blue under the rising moon. There was something in her face, not pity, not fear, something older, like she'd seen too much and learned to let it pass through her without breaking. The man stirred once near dawn, whispering something, maybe a name, maybe not. The girl never asked. The wind moved through the cottonwoods like a lullaby, and in the last light before morning, the outlaw and the girl slept under the same leaking roof, strangers bound by silence, by need, and by whatever ache had brought them both to the edge of the world. The days folded into each other like old paper, creased, quiet, half forgotten. The man did not speak for the first 2 days. Fever took him briefly, but not fiercely. He drank the broth she made from thin rabbit bones and wild sage. When she changed his bandage, he didn't flinch. He simply watched her with eyes the color of burned mesquite, not curious, not grateful, just watchful, like a man who had long ago stopped expecting kindness and now no longer knew what to do with it. The girl lived in the cabin already, though it was plain she wasn't meant to. There were no shoes at the door but her own, no other cups on the shelf, no family name scrawled above the hearth, only a rusted horseshoe nailed sideways and a strip of blue fabric tied to the window latch. The place had the feel of something borrowed, or perhaps left behind by someone who hadn't meant to leave it so long. She did not ask him to leave, nor did she ask why he'd come. She cooked. She chopped the dry cedar branches stacked along the wall. She swept the corners with a broom of bundled twigs. When he was strong enough to stand, she handed him a cup and walked past him like he had always been there. He asked her name on the third day. She looked at him like the question was in a language she hadn't heard in years. "Mara," she said. He nodded. "You?" He didn't answer. That seemed fine to her. The rhythm between them was silent and slow. She would fetch water from the dry fork of the saber, walking with a limp only visible, after long hours on her feet. He would watch her go, then scan the horizon like a man used to being hunted, though no one ever came. The town of Bell's Hollow was 5 miles west, hidden behind a low ridge and built along the bones of an old mining road. It had a church, a store, a schoolhouse, and too many eyes. Mara hadn't set foot there in more than a year. She told him this in pieces, over the sound of chopping carrots or scrubbing clothes in the tin basin. Her voice was even, like the stories weren't hers but belonged to someone who hadn't survived them. "They didn't want me there much. Said my blood didn't know which side it came from." She didn't elaborate. The man didn't ask. Some said her mother had been Apache. Others said she was the product of something darker, something not spoken about in front of children or strangers. Her face didn't betray it. Her skin was pale from desert wind, but her eyes were dark and slanted, and her cheekbones were sharp, giving shape to rumors that had long outlived their origin. When her mother died, of fever, of heartbreak no one knew, Mara stayed in the cabin. Some townsfolk left scraps by the fence. Others muttered that wild blood should not be raised so close to decent folk. The church women came once to take her away. Mara had stood barefoot at the door, arms crossed, and said no with such stillness that even the reverend's wife stepped back. She never spoke of her father, neither did the town, and now the wounded man lived beneath her roof. The first time she walked into Bell's Hollow again, the air changed. She wore her hair braided and her dress ironed, walked with her chin forward, eyes flat. The man, still limping, had asked for flour. She could have refused. Instead, she rose before dawn, hitched the old mule to the wagon, and headed west. They saw her before she reached the church bell. A child pointed. A woman leaned close to another, whispering too loud to be innocent. The storekeeper, Tommins, squared his shoulders when she entered, said nothing, but watched her every move like a man checking his pockets for what might go missing. She bought flour, salt, dried apples, left coins on the counter without waiting for change. Outside, 3 men stood near the trough, not speaking but not turning away. One of them spat at the ground when she passed. She didn't flinch. When she returned, the man was mending the roof with his shirt off, sun burning into the pale scar on his back. She tossed him the flour. "They know you're here now," she said. He didn't look down. "They'll come." He nodded once, as if the world had always worked that way. That night they ate rabbit and apples in silence. She watched the wind twist through the broken wheat behind the house, fireflies blinking through the brush like the last stars of a dying constellation. The man finally spoke. "I won't leave." She didn't answer, just kept chewing, eyes on the dark. Far off, a coyote howled, and somewhere beyond the ridge, in the town that never forgot a sin, a memory stirred awake with the sound of an outlaw's name. The days thickened. Summer swelled in the bones of the land, bleeding heat through the cracks in the earth. Dust clung to everything, hair, breath, the rim of the tin cups. Mara took to tying a damp cloth across her mouth when she swept the floors. The man spent long hours outside, wordless and methodical, repairing the fence rail by rail. The silence between them had grown into something soft, not distance, but ease, like 2 shadows learning to move around one another without touch. Once, while splitting wood, he sliced his thumb open. She took his hand and wrapped it in a strip of linen, slow and careful, her fingers grazing his palm. He watched her, not with gratitude or suspicion, but with a kind of mournful understanding, like he recognized something in her gesture, a tenderness both of them had outlived. It was on a Thursday that the first mark came. Mara had gone to Bell's Hollow again, alone, always alone. She returned with sugar, cornmeal, and a torn seam where someone had grabbed her sleeve. Said nothing. He didn't ask. That evening she stepped out to fetch water and stopped mid-step. There, scratched deep into the cabin's door with something sharp and angry, was a word neither of them said aloud. Half-breed. The letters tore across the wood like scars. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, just stood there, hands loose at her sides, the bucket lying on its side in the dust. The man came up behind her and read it once, then turned away. A moment later, he returned with a knife and began scraping, not furiously, just steady, as if removing each letter required the exact weight of his silence. When the wood was raw again, they burned sage in the hearth and sat without eating. The next day, the girl's dog, an old mutt that followed her like a little brother, was found near the well, throat cut. Flies swarmed before she even knelt beside him. She buried the animal behind the house, her hands caked with soil and salt. The man stood at a distance, watching. He said nothing, but that night he oiled his revolver by lamplight, each motion precise and slow, as if remembering how to be dangerous again. That Sunday, she went to church, wore a clean dress, braided her hair tighter than before, walked with the weight of someone who knew they were being watched from every window, every pew. The preacher hesitated when she entered. The room quieted like someone had choked the wind. She sat in the last row, alone, as always. The sermon that day spoke of purity, of bloodlines, of how the sins of the father would visit the children and their children's children. The preacher never looked at her, but every word was aimed like a stone to her ribs. Afterward, she waited for the building to empty, walked out under the blinding sun with her back straight, her breath measured. Outside, 3 men waited. One was Tommins. "You ought to take your kind elsewhere," he said. The others didn't speak, just stood there with that cruel stillness that follows men who've decided what someone is worth. The man came 2 days later into town on foot, no horse, no badge, just a limp and a stare like cold ash. He walked into the store, bought nails and matches, paid with coins marked by blood. On the way out, he passed Tommins. Neither spoke. But afterward, Tommins spat again, only this time, not at the ground. When the man returned, he had a bruise rising under one eye, one knuckle split. She didn't ask. He boiled water himself that night, sat on the porch with his hand in a basin, watching the hills darken. "I was younger than you when they branded me," he said, voice low. "Didn't matter what for, just that I was different. Never shook it off, never tried." She sat beside him, the lantern flickering between them like a slow heartbeat. "They think shame is something you can pass on," she said. "They're right," he replied, "but not the way they mean." She looked at him then, not a long look, just a glance, sharp as a match strike, and nodded once. No more was said. That night a fire burned low in the valley, just a scarecrow lit behind someone's barn, but it was a warning, a whisper. She sat awake by the window. He lay with the revolver beside his bed. Outside, coyotes howled to one another, but neither of them heard them anymore. They were listening to something deeper now, something rising in the dark, slow as smoke, and just as inevitable. Morning came gray and windless. The wheat field, once golden and wild behind the cabin, stood like a congregation of ghosts, stiff, breathless, waiting. Mara moved through it with the quiet of a girl who no longer needed to be taught caution. Her eyes swept the line of the hills beyond, noting shapes that didn't belong, a glint, a boot print, the stilled hush of a bird that had stopped singing. The man stood near the gate, hammering a loose board back into place. He had a fresh cut above his eyebrow, a finger swollen at the knuckle. His hat sat low over his brow. He didn't speak. That week, the preacher came, not to save, but to warn. He arrived with 6 men and the weight of something righteous behind him. The kind of righteousness that smells like kerosene and rides in the back of wagons with torches wrapped in oilcloth. Mara stood at the door, arms folded, hair tied back, her face unreadable. The man appeared beside her, stepping from the shadows of the porch like someone born from dusk. He stood between her and the preacher, his body angled just slightly. Shield, not threat. The preacher's horse shifted beneath him, sensing the tension even if the men did not. "You've brought danger to this place," the preacher said. It was unwise to take her in. She's not yours to defend. She's not yours to condemn, the man replied, voice low. She was born of sin. There are laws here, spoken and unspoken. That girl carries something that should have been buried with her mother. Mara didn't flinch, but her jaw tensed, and the wind picked up, scattering dust into the preacher's coat. You have until sundown, he said. Then she leaves, or we'll see to it. They turned their horses without another word. The man watched them ride until they were swallowed by heat and distance. That afternoon, he pulled an old trunk from beneath the floorboards. Inside, a long coat, a journal with no name, a broken compass, and a pistol that looked like it had been buried in 6 wars. He held it once, then wrapped it again in cloth and set it aside. He did not prepare to fight. He prepared to stay. Mara found him later in the wheat field, running his hand over the tall stalks. The field was dry, starved of rain, and the wind carried the scent of something brittle. You could leave, she said. I could, he replied, but you won't. He shook his head. She stood beside him, her shoulders brushing his arm, and they watched the horizon the way people do when they expect the worst and still hope to be wrong. At dusk, they lit lanterns along the porch, hung wet sheets soaked in vinegar over the windows. The man placed his revolver on the table, but did not load it. He sat by the fire, sharpening a knife slowly, the metal hissing against the stone with each pull. Sundown came. No one arrived. The night passed in silence. But the next day, the wheat field was burning. It began at the far edge, just a flicker, like candlelight teasing the soil. Then it rose, wide and sudden, tongues of fire leaping skyward. The wind carried it fast, cruelly. Within minutes, half the field was flame. Mara ran for water, but the man stopped her. No. She stared at him, wild-eyed. It's too far gone, he said. Let it take what it came for. They stood together and watched the fire eat what little they had grown. When it died down, there was no shouting, no horses, no torches, just smoke and ash curling through the sky like the spirit of something old and mean. That night, the girl stood barefoot in the blackened earth, soot on her face, her palms empty. She looked to the stars, not for guidance, but to make sure they still bothered to watch. The man came to her then. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, just stood beside her until the night cooled and the smoke cleared. In the distance, the church bell rang. Once, then silence. The wheat field never grew back. The fire had taken it deep, down to the roots, down to the hope that once lived in the soil. Now the ground behind the cabin was charred and black, with only the bones of stalks left standing like forgotten gravestones. Ash coated the porch steps. Smoke still lingered in the rafters, stubborn and sour. Mara swept it every morning, though there was no point. The man had not shaved in days. He spent his hours sitting beneath the old cottonwood, sharpening fence posts he no longer planned to raise. There was a finality in the way he moved now, like a man who had chosen his hill. Neither of them spoke about what came next, but the town did. Bell's Hollow whispered louder now. They saw the smoke. They saw the girl still walking through the market with shoulders squared and face clean. They saw the man by her side, not speaking, not threatening, simply being, and that was worse. There was something unforgivable about survival. A week after the fire, the Reverend returned, alone this time. He stood at the edge of the property, hat pressed to his chest, eyes tight with something that wasn't grief and wasn't guilt. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the uneasy shame of a man whose hands had been nowhere near the match, but everywhere near the silence that followed. Mara met him at the fence. "You came to finish it?" she asked. The Reverend looked down, then up again. "I came to offer mercy." She laughed, a quiet, tired sound that didn't reach her eyes. "We've had enough of that." Behind her, the man stood in the doorway, one shoulder pressed to the frame. He didn't move, but his presence filled the air like the pressure before a storm. "You can't protect her forever," the Reverend said. "I'm not," the man answered. "I'm just here until she remembers she doesn't need protecting." The Reverend's mouth twitched, an argument forming, then dying. He turned and left without another word. That evening, Mara sat on the porch with a tin cup of bitter coffee, her bare feet resting in the dust. The man sat beside her, carving something into a piece of old cedar with the slow patience of a man who didn't expect to finish. "What was your name?" she asked. He paused, then smiled. Not warm, not bitter, just faint, like someone remembering a song without the words. "I had one," he said. She nodded. They didn't speak again that night. The next morning, the cabin stood empty. No blood, no struggle, just two missing souls and a table wiped clean. The neighbors came later, some to steal, some to gawk. They found nothing but silence, except for one thing. On the wall, carved into the beam above the hearth, was a name, not hers, not his. Just one word, clean and deep: belonging. They say she was seen again, walking east along the dry river, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a satchel over one shoulder. Stronger now, taller maybe, her eyes like flint and frost. No one stopped her. The man was never seen again. But sometimes, on cold mornings when the wind shifts west, folks in Bell's Hollow swear they see a figure near the blackened wheat field, just standing, watching, as if making sure time doesn't undo what was earned. And on the church wall, scratched faintly in the old whitewash, there's a name, not hers, not his, but what he left behind.